Good evening. I'm Kelly Gear-Ripken, National Chair of A Woman's Journey. On behalf of Johns Hopkins Medicine's A Woman's Journey, thank you for joining this evening for our monthly webcast series, Conversations That Matter. A Woman's Journey strives to improve your well-being through health education. No doubt, COVID has upended our lives and has left everyone with added anxiety and stress. Tonight, we are joined by psychiatrist and former public school teacher, Dr. Hal Kroonsberg, who will discuss signs of anxiety that children may be feeling about returning to school after a challenging year of virtual learning. He will also address other issues that children have faced during COVID, including feelings of isolation and loneliness, apprehension, depression, and maybe even feelings of suicide. So please use the Q&A on your screen to pose your questions throughout the evening. And following Dr. Kroonsberg's presentation, he will respond to many of your questions. Our webcast will conclude this evening at 8 p.m. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank Johns Hopkins University's program, Hopkins at Home, for the production assistance, and you can visit their website for additional lectures and courses throughout the year. And now I'm pleased to begin tonight's conversation with Dr. Kroonsberg. Dr. Kroonsberg?
Thank you so much, Kelly. I appreciate the invitation. So just to finish out the introduction, to share a little bit about what I do. As you mentioned, I am a former 7th grade math teacher and special education teacher as well. And ultimately, that's what got me interested in child mental health. And so right now, in fact, I actually continue to work in the public school system at the Baltimore City Public School System with the Johns Hopkins School-Based Mental Health Program. And just some things to say before I dive in. I do want to mention I am a child psychiatrist. I love being a child psychiatrist, but I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a pediatrician. I'm not an infectious disease specialist. So I want to do my very best to minimize any editorializing or straying from my areas of expertise tonight. And as you mentioned, there are some things that I want to talk about before we start talking back and forth. Specifically, I want to speak about 3 areas. The first is the mental health impact of the pandemic on kids. The second is how we can help our kids return to school. And then the third is what are some warning signs that should indicate that maybe we should seek out professional help for our kids. There's a lot to talk about, but if you have any questions for me in the middle of what I'm saying that maybe could use some clarification, please feel free to jump in. So I want to start by talking about kind of what we know and what we don't know about the impact of the pandemic on child mental health. And I want to not just talk about kids, but also parents and families too. But let's start with talking about what we know about what's happened with kids. A lot of people have asked me, just how bad have things been for kids during the COVID pandemic? I've seen a lot of really alarming things published in the media about dramatic increases in suicide and models that have skyrocketing numbers of what are called deaths of despair that includes overdoses and things like that. But I think there's actually been a lot of hyperbole in the press as well. And so there are some things that I do want to try to clarify. So I'll start by talking about what happened kind of on average to children across the country. And the thing I think is really obvious is the pandemic was a huge stressor. Every year, the American Psychological Association does this big survey on stress in kids and adults. And they did publish their results taking basically inventory from kids after their first year in the pandemic. And the results are in some ways surprising and in some ways not so surprising. About 43% said their stress level increased a lot during the pandemic. About half of teens said the pandemic disrupted their future plans. About 50% said that planning for the future felt impossible. And 80% said school closures made it feel like they were less motivated to do schoolwork. I do want to emphasize, though, that stress and depression are not necessarily the same thing. And so we actually know a fair amount about how kids experience depressive symptoms as well during the pandemic. There was this big study that was just published in Pediatrics, which is one of the flagship journals for the American Association of Pediatrics. And it looked at children and adolescents' depression rating at primary care visits. And in fact, it was not actually looking at how the pandemic impacted kids. And the study goes back to well before the pandemic started. So it was this really interesting moment where they were collecting all of this information on depressive symptoms. Then the pandemic hit and they continued to collect that information. And one of the things that they found actually is depression and suicidality ratings on average went down at the start of the pandemic for the first few months. And so even though it was this really stressful moment in our society, I think a lot of kids actually kind of experienced it initially as almost a little bit like, summer vacation in the middle of the school year, or it felt like a little bit of a nice unexpected reprieve from school. But that was really temporary. And those depressive symptoms started to bounce back to pre-pandemic levels. But really interestingly, it didn't rise above the pre-pandemic levels. And again, I'm speaking about on average. So, what are the lessons that we can draw from these two, really nice information sources? So the first is we know the pandemic was a real stressor and a major disruption for kids. And that's not really surprising when we think about how much our kids have missed out on. One thing that's really important for us, I think, as parents to remember is a single year is so important for a kid. There are so many milestones that kids experience that they only get to do once. And the pandemic really disrupted that. Kids will go years, imagining their senior prom or graduation or participating in sports. And those things were really taken away from them. And so there was a lot of grief that kids experienced. And I haven't even mentioned some of the academic concerns yet. I will a little bit later. But the other thing that I think was really important about that data is in general, kids are really resilient. And so stress and sadness and worry, they're not necessarily psychiatric disorders, though they can make a kid vulnerable to them. And even though kids experienced a lot of stress and sadness and loss, overall, there didn't appear to be a concurrent massive epidemic of depressive disorders among kids. And again, that was really up till this point in the pandemic. It's hard to forecast too much about the future. But, we can talk about kids on average, but I think it's really important also to think about what's happened to some of the more vulnerable kids during the pandemic. And these are specifically kids who maybe have experienced psychiatric illness prior to the pandemic, or kids who experienced the pandemic in a way that was much more stressful than most other kids. And so one way we can try to surmise what the consequences for some of the more vulnerable kids are looking at suicide attempts, and suicide attempts in particular reported to emergency rooms. And we have a fair amount of data on that as well. So in the beginning, that first year of the pandemic, sort of 2020 from March all the way till the end of the year, differences in suicide attempts coming to our emergency departments among kids actually stayed pretty much the same. There was a slight increase for girls between the ages of 12 to 17, but in other cases, young adults 17 to 25, both boys and girls, and also boys aged 12 to 17. Things were pretty much the same from before the pandemic through the first year of pandemic. But this past year in 2021, things started to change a little bit. Suicide attempts among boys stayed mostly the same, but started to creep up a small amount. But they actually started to increase in girls ages 12 to 17 by quite a bit. In some cases, maybe even a factor of 2. In general, I think we know that girls tend to be more vulnerable to self-injury and suicide attempts than boys are in early adolescence. But this seemed to be exacerbated a little bit during the pandemic. And these findings were replicated not just in the United States, but in other countries as well, including Iceland. So the question I think a lot of people ask is, well, why is that? And, there are a lot of hypotheses. Nobody knows for sure. It seems like girls managed to have less physical activity than boys during the pandemic, and physical activity seemed to be protective. There was also more time spent on social media for girls than boys. And we do know that, really heavy use of social media can also make kids a little bit more vulnerable to depression or anxiety too. And then finally, like what we've seen anecdotally at Hopkins, I think is important too. And I think we've gotten a sense that kids who are struggling a little bit more. Depression seems to be a little bit more severe, and we're seeing more highly symptomatic kids with other mood disorders too, like bipolar disorder. And that may be because that's a condition that can be exacerbated greatly by disruptions in sleep and routine. And we know this about anxiety disorders and many other psychiatric disorders too. And there are few easier ways to mess up sleep habits, routines than the pandemic, basically. I want to talk a little bit about parents too. So in March of 2021, that American Psychological Association survey had a lot of data on parents too. And one of the things, again, some of this stuff may not be obvious, but stress levels went up dramatically for parents during the pandemic, certainly compared to other adults. There were substantial weight changes reported in about 70% of parents reporting an undesired weight change, either gaining weight or losing weight that they didn't intend for. 80% of parents slept more or less than they wanted. About 25% of parents were diagnosed with a psychiatric condition, and about 50% of adults in general delayed or canceled healthcare services for themselves. So, parents definitely have been struggling through the pandemic. And as a parent myself, it has been an unbelievable challenge. And we do know that when parents struggle, that can trickle down a little bit to our kids as well. And then finally, thinking about what happened to families in the pandemic is also really important. Routines, first and foremost, were pretty much obliterated by it. We know that rituals and routines can be really helpful. They can give parents, they can give kids a sense of predictability and control. And those things kind of went out the window in many cases. We did see more use of harsh physical discipline in homes. There were huge financial stressors for many families, childcare disruptions. And for many families, it just kind of made life feel less stable and more tenuous kind of at every turn. And we know that stress is something that is experienced by kids as well. So what can we conclude from what we know so far? So I think it's really important for us to remember not all kids experience the pandemic in the same way. So many kids were really resilient to the disruption. Again, depression scores on average didn't go up. Even on the stress surveys, about half of kids almost seemed relatively unfazed by what was going on. But some kids are more vulnerable to pandemic stress than others. And that's shown by the increase in suicide attempts that we saw. And there are many reasons for that. Some kids are just generally more emotionally sensitive than others. And while typically that can be totally fine, and in fact, in some cases, really beneficial, for kids that are experiencing a great deal of stress, it can be exhausting and really wear down their defenses. Other kids might have psychiatric conditions that are especially sensitive to pandemic stressors, like mood disorders like bipolar disorder. If you think about anxiety disorders as well, particularly kids that have concerns about, getting sick or contamination or things happening to family, there are many, many, many more completely understandable reasons for them to be worried about that. And a lot of other kids really need interpersonal connections to be at their best. And those things, can only be approximated by, Zoom conversations and things like that. But the other thing that I think is really important is that some kids faced more stress in the pandemic than others. A quote that I saw that really nicely encapsulates that is, we're all in the same storm, but we're not actually in the same boat. We know that COVID impacted people of color differently. There's a great piece actually in the New Yorker, in the lay press, that I believe was called The Black Plague, that wrote extensively about the different effect of COVID physiologically on African Americans than Caucasians. There's higher mortality among people of color as well. And some of the things that we saw in Maryland, particularly as relates to mental health, typically African Americans have lower rates of suicide than Caucasians, but actually in the pandemic, those rates started to change. And the suicide rates for African Americans went up pretty significantly. And again, we don't know for certain why that is, but I think it's reasonable to speculate that the stressors of the pandemic were not felt equally among all people. We can also think about how this relates to socioeconomic status as well. Wealthier kids experience the pandemic differently from kids who aren't. For instance, in Baltimore, a lot of private schools often were able to meet in person, whereas public schools didn't meet. So these kids kids attending public school in Baltimore had less social contact than kids attending private school. They had less kind of individualized instruction, that they might have gotten less ability to participate in a lot of extracurricular activities. And we know that plays a toll on kids. And then additionally, the financial stressors of the pandemic were experienced differently by different kids as well. And one example that I experienced a lot with many of the kids that I was working with, all of a sudden, not only did they have their school responsibilities, but they were also now thrust into the role of needing to take care of younger siblings during the day too, because parents needed to work and they couldn't necessarily kind of do work via Zoom or work from home. And so now kids who are already juggling a lot suddenly found themselves juggling a lot more. And it's a huge stressor to be a 15-year-old in high school that's trying to, graduate from high school while also taking care of some younger kids. So that's, a little bit about what we know about the pandemic and the impact that it's had on kids. But, I do think it's really important that we spend some time talking about returning to school as well. And, as of the last time I checked, Baltimore City is still fully committed to having school return in person. There are a small number of students that had committed already virtually, and they committed for the entire year. But for the most part, folks are preparing for a full in-person return, at least as of right now. So, just as different people experience the pandemic differently, I think different people need to prepare for the return differently as well. So I want to talk about how we can prepare kids and also how we can prepare ourselves. And some of what I'm going to say applies not just to the start of school, but also, school, continuing to be in progress. Because I just think it's really important for us to acknowledge that this is going to be a bumpy ride. I think it's going to be a challenge getting acclimated to school. And then once kids get acclimated to school, there are going to be a whole new set of challenges that come as well. But I do want to talk specifically about sort of 3 categories of kids to help us think about how we want to address our kid that may be struggling with that transition. And I also want to talk about parents as well, but I'll start with kids. So the first is, the one category is the anxious child. Another category might be the overly excited child. And then the third category might be the extremely comfortable child. But before I dive in and talk about that, I do want to talk about something called validation. And the reason for that is it's going to be a really essential tool that we as parents make use of when we're talking to our kids and understanding their experience. So basically what validation is, it's recognizing the legitimacy of someone else's emotional experience. When we validate, we communicate to our kids that they have a right to feel how they do. And when we see the situation from their perspective, their feelings make sense. Sometimes the easiest way to articulate and describe validation is by kind of describing the opposite, which is sometimes called invalidation. So a story that I like to tell sometimes came from actually a kid that I was working with. And this was a kid who had really severe school anxiety and had a really hard time getting to school. And she shared the story where she was stuck in bed. She just couldn't get herself to go. Her worry level was too high. And her mom, who she loved, came and found her and sat on her bed and said, I know that, this is a really scary thing for you, but your people at school really like you a lot. Your grades are really good. And there's going to be a time in the future where you look back on this and think about how ridiculous it was that you were so scared to go to school. And this was a mom who was doing her very, very best to be supportive of her kid. And at the same time, to hear from the kid's perspective, she said, I know my mom was trying really hard, but all I was hearing was, you shouldn't be worried, you shouldn't be worried, you shouldn't be worried, you shouldn't be worried. And it just made me feel like she didn't understand. And so we can, with the best of intentions, wind up kind of inadvertently telling our kids that they actually shouldn't feel the way that they do. And we actually, I'll just tell one study story that I thought was kind of interesting. There was a study that was done where they would check people's kind of physiologic arousal level by checking heart rate and something called skin conduction level. And they had people solve these unsolvable math problems. And one group, the person administering the test would say things like, I know this is a really hard test. A lot of people have really struggled with it. It makes sense that you would struggle with that. And their level of physiological arousal started to go down, and they were able to kind of tolerate the experience a lot better. And then the other group, the tester was saying, I don't understand what the problem is. So many people seem to have a much easier time of it than you. And for those people taking the test, their level of physiological arousal went up really, really high. So this is kind of a universal experience that all humans have when somebody tells them that they shouldn't feel the way that they do. And at the same time, validation is really hard, kind of telling kids that, I get where you're coming from. What you're saying makes sense. And that's because as parents, we don't want to see our kids in distress. So our instinct is sometimes to say, don't feel that way. You should feel something else, because we want that feeling to go away for ourselves. And validation can also be kind of tricky. So for example, like if your child fails a test and says, I'm the stupidest person in the world, we want to validate the emotion, but not necessarily the content. So the way we would validate would be, I can understand how this grade would cause you to doubt yourself. As opposed to saying, no, you're right, you must be the stupidest person in the world. When we validate, we want to identify what is the feeling that my kid is experiencing. And then we want to understand, why might they be experiencing it that way? And because when our kids are experiencing distress or sadness, it's really important that we do this. It lowers the temperature in the room, and it helps our kids feel heard and understood. And when our kids feel heard and understood, they're much more open to, problem solving with you as a parent, because they feel like, okay, I know my mom gets it. I know my dad gets it. They know what I'm going through. So that means I can trust the solutions that they're offering. And just in general, it helps build healthier and more trusting relationships. So I know that was kind of a long aside, but, I can't say enough about validation as kind of the, almost like the lifeblood of the relationships that we have with friends, with kids, with spouses, with parents, with everybody. And it's a really important thing that we practice, especially at a time where we're spending so much time with one another during the pandemic. Okay, so I do want to talk a little bit about kids and approaching kids. So let's start with the anxious child. So, I think we can trust ourselves in many cases to know when our kid is worried or anxious. But, that doesn't necessarily mean we'll know why they're feeling anxious. So the most important thing we can do to start when approaching our kid is to try to understand what's going on. So first, we want to seek to understand the fear, because it's really easy to think that a kid might be worried about returning to school because of COVID. They're worried about exposure to the illness, but they may actually have worries about leaving home. They may be worried about, their sibling who's going to a different school that they may not be able to look after they've been able to look after them for a year and a half. The fear of returning may have nothing to do with COVID whatsoever. And it's really important for us not to jump to that conclusion. One of the things that I think is going to be really important for us to think about a lot as parents is, what are my kids' academic concerns? As a teacher, we've had decades to figure out how we're supposed to teach in person. There are so many books written about their schools of education that are, dedicated to helping teachers teach in person. We had months to figure out how to do virtual learning. And, for some kids, virtual learning worked out great. And for other kids, it really isn't the way that their brains are kind of meant to take in information. And so, I think we're going to see a huge variability of academic readiness within the classroom. And there are going to be many kids who either got used to virtual learning and it was a method that really worked for them, or all of a sudden they're worried about, oh my God, I'm so far behind. What if my peers are way ahead of me? What if I'm going to go to school and, I'm not going to know anything and everybody else is going to know everything. And again, the whole time, if we don't take time to understand what the worry is, we may be saying, oh, I'm sure, don't worry about it. Just wash your hands and everything will be fine, when the worries are something tied to something completely different. One thing I would also just say as a teacher, and this is, I think important, is it's going to be a real challenge for teachers to teach too. And when it's hard to teach, it can be really hard to manage a classroom. So teachers will be under a tremendous amount of stress as well, because as I mentioned before, there is going to be that huge variability of academic readiness within the classroom. And so I would just, we're all going to have to be patient with one another as we sort of figure things out as we go back. But sort of going back to how we would address our own kids, the first thing we want to do is we want to validate and normalize their fears, particularly if it relates to COVID itself. Schools were closed for a reason, and at the same time, they're opening for a reason too. And, it's important also to recognize that some fear is actually quite protective and helpful. We can all think back to our childhoods and remember, the handful of kids that we knew that seemed to have no fear of anything. And they were always, getting hurt, jumping off of stuff, or, putting themselves in unsafe situations. So we want our kids to be a little bit fearful, but not too much. We still want to make sure that we emphasize safety, like mask wearing, washing our hands, social distancing. But by now we have a vague enough idea of what's reasonable as a health precaution and what might be kind of overkill a little bit too. So, we don't necessarily want to encourage our kids to wear like an N95 mask if they're going on an outdoor hike with no other people. There is kind of a middle ground there. So for kids that are anxious about going to school, one of the most important things we can do though is plan ahead. We want to make a game plan with our child and the school for what they can do if they're feeling uncomfortable. So we'll want to be able to identify within the school adults that they can talk to. What are the parameters when it might be reasonable for them to call a parent? All sorts of sort of contingencies for how to manage these fears when they arrive. I also think it's totally reasonable for us to consider rewards for kids still going to school amid anxiety. So those rewards can be all sorts of different things. They can be special time in the evening. They could also be, other sorts of rewards that kind of recognize the child's efforts to face their fear. So again, it can also be important to remind ourselves, it's not a bribe for getting our kids to go to school. It's a show of appreciation for them doing something that's actually really challenging. So that's how I think we ought to approach kind of kids who are experiencing anxiety, by validating and by planning, especially. But with the excited child, it's a different story. These are kids that maybe are not quite anxious enough about returning to school. These are kids there are so many kids that I work with that didn't like school before the pandemic and are just like, oh my God, I cannot wait to go back. It is all I want to do. I just want to go back. And it's wonderful to hear as a psychiatrist and a teacher. It's kind of music to my ears. But also, you want to say to these kids, slow down a little bit. I'm really glad you're excited. And it's going to be a little bit different from what you're expecting. For these kids, we really actually want to emphasize safety first, wearing masks, washing hands, practicing social distancing as well. And I think especially for kids who haven't done this in a while, we want to help kids, especially younger kids, get into a routine of doing these safety precautions while also wearing a mask for longer periods of time. The first day of school is not going to be a great time for a kid to wear a mask for the very first time for a number of hours in the day. And this is something that for our daughter, as soon as she turned 2, apparently that's the magical age at which kids are going to be able to and need to tolerate wearing masks for really long periods of time. So for us, it was really important to start practicing early and going through routines. So for instance, the moment our daughter came home from daycare, we'd spray her with hand sanitizer. The moment we came back in the house, and I think initially she was like, I don't really understand what's going on. Sometimes she didn't like it. It smelled weird. But getting her into the routine of it made it not a big deal whatsoever. It's also going to be important to let our kids know that their peers may not feel quite as excited about them as going back. And that it's going to be really important for them to respect their peer space and follow the school rules. And the good news is, though, there are lots of ways that you can practice doing this out in the community, reinforcing what distancing means, practicing getting kids in the habit of wearing a mask, washing your hands. This is the time to start doing that and start practicing that. The playground's a great place to do that, too. So again, I think, once again, practicing and setting clear guidelines and expectations is a way that makes a lot of sense to approach a kid that you have that may be almost too excited to go back to school. And then the third category, I would say, is the very comfortable child. And these are the kids that I think would be really happy for things to remain exactly as they were during the pandemic. And that could be for a bunch of reasons. I think being home might be exactly what your child wants. There are a number of kids that I work with that actually did really well academically, and in fact did better than they had at any other time. These are kids that maybe got in trouble all the time at school, but now in a different environment, being at home with fewer things to distract them or fewer kids that they were maybe trying to impress, they weren't getting in trouble anymore. And it's going to be really challenging for them to get back to, and they have a lot of reluctance to do it, but it's not necessarily because they're anxious, but because they were like, no, things were actually going really well for me. And then, alternatively, there are kids who had the opportunity to play a whole lot of Fortnite, and that's going to be a shock to their system when they go from being able to play pretty much all day to being in the school setting. And so it's pretty likely that that these kids will be pretty resistant to return to school initially. And so I think, once again, this is all about preparation and getting practice in. So some of the things you can do is consider removing some of or limiting some of the reinforcers that kids experience when they stay at home. So for instance, now might be a time where you would want to say, hey, you know what, from the school hours, let's say 7 to 3 p.m., there are not going to be any video games today. Or for the kids who are just really, really used to being in the house during that time, you may want to kind of do trial runs to say, okay, we're going to be outside of the house from 7 to 3 today. And once again, I think for these kids, it's totally reasonable to consider kind of reinforcers or rewards for attending school. One of the best rewards I think we can offer a lot of times as parents is positive attention, hanging out with our kids and letting them kind of dictate what they're doing, whether it's watching a special TV show that they choose or playing a board game with them or something along those lines where we're with them. They're a little bit in charge too. So it is really important that we recognize that it's not just kids that are going to be facing a major adjustment. It's going to be parents too. I do want to talk a little bit about how anxious parents, again, totally reasonable to be anxious. And I think it would almost be a little bit weird as a parent if you weren't anxious about it. But I do want to talk a little bit about how we can try to prepare. So the first thing that I want to talk about, though, is something that we see a lot in psychiatry, and it's a thing called projection. Projection is what's called technically a defense mechanism. And that's when we can't tolerate a particular feeling that we're feeling. So we project that feeling onto someone else. And that may sound like a little bit bizarre or magical, but sort of to give an example, when we are feeling anxiety and we can't tolerate our anxiety, that could be because we've decided, I'm the parent, I'm not supposed to be anxious, I'm supposed to be in charge all the time. One of the ways that our minds can defend itself is by assuming that actually it's our child that's the one that's anxious. And so, we maybe say, what are you worried about? What are you worried about? What are you worried about? And the kid actually may say, I'm actually doing okay. But we keep asking them again and again and again. Then it might be time to check in with ourselves and say, wait a second, maybe I'm the one that's anxious in this scenario. Again, it's totally reasonable to be anxious about that. But I do think it's really important that we kind of regularly check in with ourselves and ask ourselves, how am I doing? What am I feeling? I know as parents, we can feel this need to always be in charge and always be kind of totally managing things and doing a wonderful job. But oh boy, it has been an unbelievably difficult year and a half, and we still have difficult times ahead of us too. And I think it's really, really critical that we're kind to ourselves, but also kind of inquisitive about ourselves too. How are we making it through this? Almost, if we told ourselves 3 years ago, this is what we'd be experiencing as parents, we would say, there's absolutely no way I could make it through. So, like I said, know what you're feeling too, and be okay with having feelings. But there are things that we can do to mitigate our anxiety too. And first and foremost, it's really important to know what our school's plans are. Know who the point person at the school is going to be for communicating changes in policies, because I think it's safe to assume the rules are going to change a lot as the year goes on. This will help us address some worries about the unknown, but also, help parents know how to prepare for our kids returning. Knowing the rules actually can go a long way in helping us sort of picture how things are going to go. So we'll want to know, what are the new policies for kids, but also, contingencies as well. What do you do if your kid is feeling sick? What's the process? Who do we let know? How do I get in contact with my pediatrician? What's going to happen if a kid or a teacher in the classroom tests positive for COVID? Will my kid be home for 2 weeks? Are they going to shut everything down? Or will just that one person be out and kids go back to school? These are things that are actually going to be really, really important to know about, because we're going to need to plan for them too. It's inevitable also that colds are going to be spreading in school. And with a 2-year-old in daycare, she is sick. What seems like every week she comes home with a new virus. So it's really, really important to have a plan for, how do I get my kid tested? For us, at least, the primary care physician is always the best place to start. And then also knowing what the school's protocol for communicating that information is. That's something that's probably going to change a lot. But, having a vague idea of, how much time from work am I going to have to miss? How many days home is my kid going to have? These are really important things that we can find out now, rather than in the moment when all of a sudden we need to find out kind of instantaneously, to mitigate our own anxiety, sort of picturing how we can make it through a likely but an unpleasant scenario. So those are ways that we can sort of prepare and advance. I also want to talk a little bit about, what we should be noticing if some of the stress is getting to be too much for our kids. It's really worth noticing the warning signs that our kids may be struggling beyond what they may be able to handle. So a couple of things that's important to remember all the time, though. It's okay for kids to struggle, and everyone has the right to a few bad days. Remember, on average, in spite of how difficult the year was, on average, kids were pretty resilient through the pandemic. But even though kids are resilient, they are not indestructible. So I think main concerns might be for the emergence of either a depressive disorder, an anxiety disorder, and also suicidal thoughts. For a depressive disorder, again, remember, sadness is normal. It's totally normal for kids. It's totally normal for adults. But, when we think of depression, we tend to think of kids who are really sad or irritable in particular. So again, for kids, irritability can be one of the hallmarks of depression as well. But it's not just sad or irritable. Some of the time, it's sad or irritable on most days and for most of the day. There are other things that we can notice too, like big changes in sleep, appetite, or sort of a ability or willingness to care for themselves. Like, a kid who normally takes immaculate care of doing their hair, showering every day, suddenly not really doing that. Losing interest in preferred activities. Like, let's say they love to paint and all of a sudden saying, I paint, but it doesn't do anything for me anymore. That would be a warning sign as well. Depression can also be associated with new difficulties in concentrating, and certainly things to watch out for would be thoughts of wishing your child, saying that they were wishing that they might not be alive. For an anxiety disorder, as I mentioned before, some worry is actually a good thing. It's really protective. There's a lot of totally reasonable stuff to be worried about right now. So the question, though, is when are things tipping over to an anxiety disorder where treatment might be warranted? So oftentimes that's when the worry level is so intense that kids can't stop it or control the worries, that it's keeping them awake all night long, that it's causing them to be incredibly restless and it's really difficult to sit still, that there's a constant fear that something awful might happen, that it's just unrelenting. And a way that I often will describe kind of an anxiety disorder is, an anxiety disorder will start to shrink your kid's universe. So for example, let's say you have a kid that loves to play soccer, but all of a sudden they have this really intense phobia of getting into a car accident. And they say, as much as I love soccer, I'm not getting in the car, I'm not going to practice. That's a kid whose universe is starting to shrink a little bit. They're avoiding the activities that they really love, avoiding people that they typically really enjoy seeing. That might be a time where I think it might be warranted to think about treatment. And then finally, I did want to address suicide. So one thing that I think is really important for parents to know is asking about safety is not going to implant the idea of self-harm or suicide in your child's head. It's okay to ask about it. And I think a lot of times it's important to ask about it too. And it's not going to make things worse. But if you are going to ask, it is really important, I think, to make it part of a conversation about how your child is doing overall. Safety is really, really important, but it's still just a piece of your kid's overall well-being. And so we want to get an understanding of how our kids are doing in sort of totality. And it's also really important for us, I mentioned projection and anxiety. It's really important for us to check in with ourselves. When we ask kids about their safety, we want to say, am I asking to see how my kid is doing or to alleviate my own anxiety? And so sometimes when we ask over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, that may actually be more to kind of manage our own feelings as parents than to really check in to see how our kid is doing, because it's probably not going to be changing every 20 minutes or every half an hour. So I talked a little bit about when to seek care. I think the key is when mood or anxiety is getting in the way of functioning. And that's when you start to see grades really declining, activities that kids typically enjoy suddenly starting to drop, and also when safety is a concern. It is, though telemental health and telemedicine visits have really, I think, expanded access for many kids looking to get into treatment, it can still be hard to find providers too. In general, for a lot of parents, I actually recommend their primary care physician is a really great place to start. And all pediatric primary care providers in the state of Maryland have access to this really awesome network called BHIP, which, full disclosure, I am a small part of that, but that can help for primary care providers to get referrals to outside treaters, and even in some cases get advice about prescribing medications as well. Also, many schools, in particular public schools, have relationships with mental health providers as well. And just to put in a plug for Hopkins, where I work, there's a ton of really great programs, not just at Johns Hopkins Children's Center and the sort of the downtown hospital campus, but also at Johns Hopkins Bayview and also at Kennedy Krieger Institute. So those were the main things that I wanted to touch on before we had a chance to do a little bit of back and forth with questions. So thank you so much for giving me time for that. And now I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kronsberg. Wow, lots of information. And I just wanted to make a note that we're having some big storms in the Baltimore area. So if for you viewers who are out there, this is being recorded, and you'll be able to pick this up on our website in the coming weeks. So make sure that if you don't catch it now, you can catch it in a few weeks. Anyway, so let's continue forward. I couldn't agree with you more, Dr. Kronsberg, about the validation emotionally. I mean, that I think is probably actually one at the top of the list, because I think a lot of people tend to forget that, and for children and even for adults, but how important that is. So I'm so glad you mentioned that. So before we get started with our viewing audience questions, I want to ask you a question. What thing has surprised you about how children are dealing with the changes caused by COVID in their lives? Has there been any one big surprise, or a few of them, or not really?
Well, that's such a good question. So a lot of things have surprised me, and I mentioned this a little bit before, but and I'm almost like a little bit embarrassed to be this surprised by it. But just as things progressed, even kids who just hated going to school, who really struggled with school, they want so badly to be back. And it's really nice to hear, but also highlights just how important that structure is for kids, and that sort of interpersonal connection. And I will say, in many ways, I think if you'd asked me at the start of the pandemic what child mental health would be like, I think I would have underestimated kids' resilience in general. The extent to which, the sort of epidemic of depression hasn't hit in the same way that we might have anticipated has been really surprising and really impressive too. And I think that speaks to how resilient kids are, but also how hard everyone has worked in our society to kind of approximate the things that we're missing as best as we possibly could. There's no substitute for a lot of the things that were lost, but as an example, one of the schools that I work at, they couldn't do senior prom. So instead what they did was they had like a photo shoot with a professional photographer that took these like just unbelievable pictures of the seniors and they'll have that with them forever. And it's not the same, but the creativity that kids and adults have shown it's been awesome. It's been really wonderful to see.
I think that's great. I'm glad you touched on that, because if I believe the majority of the kids' ages that you were talking about were 17 and maybe below. So I'm glad you touched on that, because I think it is important. There's a lot of young people out there that are going off to college for the first time, and you just mentioned their senior year. It just kind of didn't turn out to be what they were hoping, but so thank you for doing that. I'm going to get right to the questions then, because we got a lot of them. So one was a question by Ellie, and she was wondering, she says, after reading last year's PACE study, now I'm not familiar with the PACE study, so maybe you can talk about that in a minute, but she says, after reading last year's PACE study documenting severe increase in adolescent depression, she was surprised by some of the data that you discussed. So I'm not quite sure, maybe you could elaborate on that. I don't know what the PACE study is. Maybe you could mention.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that acronym off the top of my head. And I will say, I think anxiety and depression are, two different animals. And the study in particular that I cited from pediatrics focused a little bit more on depressive symptoms. It used a very particular universal depression screening tool that I think, is pretty standard for a lot of pediatric primary care visits. I think for anxiety, and in speaking to a lot of my colleagues too, there's sort of a, and this is why sometimes it can be difficult to think about things on average, particularly when there's almost what's called a bimodal distribution, which is for anxiety, kids who did really well and did really poorly. So for a lot of kids who have a lot of anxiety that's school related, actually, there was almost this, oh man, this is really nice being at home and doing virtual learning. For other kids who have a lot of anxiety around things like illness, safety, things like that, their anxiety actually went up quite a bit at the start of the pandemic too. So again, that's why I think it is really important to kind of recognize that different kids experienced anxiety differently.
Makes sense. Thank you. We have a question from Rose, and you touched on this briefly with parents who are suffering themselves from COVID anxiety and even depression. So her question would be, what advice do you have if one parent is suffering from depression and severe anxiety due to COVID, to the point that children aren't allowed to do many activities because the parent is still afraid, to step into a store? And so how does that pass on then to the anxiety or even depression, whatever, onto the young child?
It's a really good question. I think kids are often, they're really, really sensitive to, they're almost like, anxiety detectors. They're really good at noticing what parents are struggling with. Many times when parents are experiencing their own struggles and they sort of disclose that to their kids will say, I actually kind of figured that. In the same way that as parents, we pick up a lot on our kids that they maybe think that they're really capable of hiding from us. So one thing,
game changer though, if parents are that way, do you feel that looking down the road, would that be a game changer for a young child if they're dealing with a parent that is so stressed out, or as their anxiety is so off the charts and they've been dealing with this for over a year now and continues on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I hate to sort of give a non-answer, but I would say it depends on just how limiting things are for the kids. Mm-hmm. One thing that I would say for parents is, it is absolutely reasonable for parents to be, really scared about this time. And if they feel like they, can't bear the thought of losing sight of their kid for a second because they're so worried about what might happen to them, it might be reasonable to consider seeking treatment themselves. And I oftentimes will let parents know that I think that's actually one of the most effective ways that they can help their kids get better is by getting treatment themselves.
Yeah, excellent point. I agree. Maybe even some family counseling if need be.
Absolutely.
Yep. So our next question is from Ellie, and her question is, should parents force their kids to go to school? And then how do we respond to a confrontation, like when it's time to get on the school bus or you're dropping them off at school and they don't want to go, so you force them?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a really good question, and there's a really complicated answer for that. So I'll get to the second part first, I guess, which is kind of like, what do you do if your kid's just like not willing to go? And I hate to say it quite like this. It depends a little bit on how old your kid is and how big your kid is. Mm-hmm. I have a 2-year-old. She likes it at daycare. Maybe she's having a rough day that morning. I can kind of pick her up and drop her off. And if she just can't make it through the day, they'll let me know. But usually she kind of bounces back pretty quickly. But you can't really do that with a 16-year-old. And so the question is kind of what do you do? And as I mentioned before, the most important thing we need to do first is figure out, why is my kid not willing to go to school right now? Is it because they're worried about COVID? Is it because they're worried about being bullied? Is it because they're worried about something else? And I will say, oftentimes the answer is because they're worried about leaving home. There's something going on at home that they're afraid of being away from. It's something that I've seen time and time again. And so, one of the most effective ways we can kind of address a kid who is not willing to go to school is kind of to address the issue that's causing them to want to stay home. So that's one thing, is to better understand the problem before you can start to address it. Because if it's a kid who has academic concerns, that has a completely different approach than a kid who's worried about actually contracting the illness. But then the second thing is, well, what do you do if they're just not willing to go on the bus and or be dropped off or something like that, and I can't pick my kid up, and I don't want to do that. And I think it's fine if that's not the approach that you want to take. And so I think the goal then is we want home to be an environment that we kind of call a non-reinforcing environment. So if your kid is not willing to go to school, that doesn't mean that they can stay home and they can play video games all day. There's going to be a very small number of things that, that they'll do to keep themselves occupied. But this is, we want to not sort of inadvertently reward a kid for not going to school. So again, it's a mix of trying to kind of understand what the underlying problem is, but not creating an environment that actually is, whether we mean to or not, encouraging a kid to stay home.
Yeah, I think that's very tricky. I think there's a fine line there, right? For all kinds of reasons. Listen, my kids are grown, but I certainly remember there were lots of reasons why they didn't want to go to school, and some of them were, maybe not really good ones, other than I did get enough sleep last night. But I would imagine, now that's very challenging to find.
And if I could just say one thing about that too, that I forgot to mention that I think is really important is kids not going to school is something that parents can understandably experience as incredibly frustrating, because to a parent, there's a very simple solution to this problem, and that is go to school. If you go to school, the problem will be solved. And so that can cause all sorts of anger, frustration, anxiety, things like that, when it seems like there's a deceptively simple solution to the problem and it's just not happening. That can frustrate everybody that's involved. And so that's why, again, I think it's just so important to take a step back, recognize that, if the solution were that simple, it would have been done by now. Many of the kids who don't go to school say, I wish I could get myself to go, but I just can't for this reason. And so, giving yourself a second to settle and then be curious.
I see. And on that note, it goes right into our next question by Sandra. So how have you seen children respond to prolonged social distancing and self-isolation that's resulted from, learning online rather than in a social construct of a classroom?
Really good question. And I would say it's actually been pretty variable in my experience, in part because, it is, and I know I mentioned social media use can be associated with elevated levels of depression and anxiety. Also, it is really effective at kids being able to kind of stay connected to one another too. For a lot of boys, actually, socializing through video games is kind of how they do it. And they've been pretty content, and they still talk about their friends like they see them all the time. And so, I would say it's been pretty variable in that way. For some kids, being able to communicate through social media is good enough. And for others, there is this sort of, it feels inadequate and insufficient. And there is a real intense sense of kind of loneliness and emptiness that these kids feel. And it's that kind of loneliness and emptiness. Those are the kids that I think are often really, really vulnerable to their feelings kind of being more intense than they can manage.
So when you're actually talking about because right now in the moment, but what happens to those kids then, years from now or 10 years from now? The ones who, all of these children have been home and they're on social media and they're doing all that, but we really don't know yet what the result is, right? I know, like I'm saying, years from now, 5, 10, whatever years from now, what was the dramatic effect of being at home and being on their PlayStations or Xbox or, all of, doing all of that?
It's a really good question. And, if I don't know that social media has been around quite long enough for the data to be in just yet. But having, and I even have tried to look into some of the literature that maybe even approximates things a little bit, like for Hurricane Katrina, for instance. That was this huge stressor that uprooted so many kids. But, honestly, it's a little bit comparing apples to oranges. So I think as far as the long-term sequelae, we're going to have to wait and see. But again, I continue to be impressed with kids' resilience. Yep.
It is amazing. I wish I wish as an adult we could have some of that resilience, right?
Yeah.
So you talked briefly about some diversity in people of color. And so Debbie has a question. How can African Americans and Latinos respond to stress?
So just in general, I think one thing that is really important is trying to maintain some, and I think this isn't just for children of color as well, but really for all kids, but that's kind of maintaining a connection to your community. And I know for many families for many people that may be family, and trying to maintain as strong a sense of connection with your family as you can. For others, it can be faith-based communities. And I think that sort of connection is really important, especially, and then also, neighborhood ties too, I think can be really important. Some of the most important kind of social connections that I feel like that I know that my family has had have just been with our neighbors and with the people that are right next door, and seeing people on the street and saying hello, waving from afar, things like that. Having a drink at the end of the evening on the stoop, I think is really, really important. And so I think that's not just important for people of color, but really for everybody too.
I agree. I think feeling that you're a part of something, a community, it will help make you feel less isolated, and and that we're all going through this together. So I think that's an excellent point. So we have another question from Sandra, and she would like to know, how do I explain, it's a good question, how do I explain to my child why he or she has to wear a mask all day in school, while his or her friend in another school is not required to wear a mask?
So that's a really, really good question. And, I don't know that I have like a snappy answer to that necessarily, but, I would say that experience isn't quite as novel as it may seem, because if we think about it, when our kids go to their friend's house and things like that, they have different rules at their friend's house too. You may have a no shoes on house, and your friends may have you can keep your shoes on and stand on the furniture if you really want kind of house. And you still, when you come back home, you still got to take your shoes off. And likewise, some kids get to play video games all they want. They get to watch R-rated movies, but that doesn't necessarily mean those are the rules at our house. And, I think you can say, here are the reasons why this rule exists at your school. And I don't know that you necessarily need to like tie yourself in a knot trying to explain, whether it's differences in sort of the politics of the place where they are, or, difference. You don't have to say, well, the positive test rate here is 4.7%, whereas there I think you can sometimes just say, it's just a little bit different from one place, just like it is at our house.
Sure. So our next question is from Eleanor, and she wants to know, if my child has been withdrawn emotionally and seems to get enjoyment from daily interactions with other children, how can I start a conversation without scaring my child or appearing to make assumptions?
So, I think keeping things as open-ended as possible in starting that conversation and just being curious. I think it's okay to tell a teenager, sometimes I have a hard time knowing what it's like to be you, and I'd like to get a little bit of a better sense of that. Sure. And so really starting there, I mentioned some of the things that you would want to like watch out for potentially, particularly as relates to signs of depression. I think it's also okay to say as a parent, if you're worried about safety, to say not so much like I'm asking you this question for my own good, but actually to be honest and say, this is something that I worry about a little bit sometimes. I want to make sure that you're doing okay. And as a parent, it's really important to me that I just know. And so I think we can make it scary when we say something like, if you say this, we're going to go get in the car and go straight to the emergency room, or something along those lines. You can sort of work things out and kind of figure out a plan after you know the story. There's no need to kind of leap to conclusions about what you're going to do next before you know.
Right. So it sounds like, Dr. Krunsberg, that really, communication is key.
Oh, yeah.
and, validation, communication, and observing, kind of stepping back for a second, maybe before you jump to, all of the big conclusions. And, because one other question, and this will be our last question, is there evidence between childhood isolation and increased rate of childhood suicide? Are you finding that?
So, I think it's hard to draw firm conclusions from things that have kind of happened in the past. Because if you think about, a kid who experiences isolation may be isolating because they experienced depression, because there wasn't at that time like a pandemic that was forcing all kids to stay in their own homes. Mm-hmm. So, in those instances, looking back at, what may be in the literature about kids who isolate themselves socially, it may not be kind of an apples to apples comparison, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. Well, I hate to interrupt you, and I just looking at the clock here, and I see that we're running out of time, but I want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Kronsberg and each of you for joining us this evening. And Dr. Kronsberg has graciously agreed to respond to any unanswered questions that were asked this evening. And you also will find relevant articles available on our website. In a couple of weeks, you'll receive an email outlining the outstanding questions and answers. And tomorrow, you'll receive an email asking you to complete a brief survey about tonight's webcast. In the coming days, a video of tonight's live streams will be available on the A Woman's Journey website, hopkinsmedicine.org/A Woman's Journey, under Conversations That Matter. If you have enjoyed tonight's discussions, please check out our website, hopkinsmedicine.org/A Woman's Journey, to watch for announcements about future conversations, podcasts, and special programs brought to you by A Woman's Journey. In the meantime, we hope you will find our monthly email informative and engaging. Good night and stay well.